So this is Julie Christian, and she and Jim Clark, they're going to do a presentation tonight. And it was kind of exciting to find out about this event. Just it seems like mysterious and a little bit spooky, but a lot of fun. And it was also interesting to know that Jim and Julie, they met in 2021, right in the midst of COVID. That started when all this research started, and she and Jim, they met like every day, or not every day, but like a lot of time. They spent a lot of time with masks on, but they just thought this was so important and would be so interesting for people to know about.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much on behalf of 174 individuals for coming to tonight's presentation. It's been 3 years in the making. What you're seeing in the back of the room are 71 individuals whose human remains remain lost. So they're either in the back of a dump truck at the building of the Cove or the BackRiver condominiums, or another project that was going on when the ammunition depot was there. And I'm sure it was done inadvertently. So if anything, at the end of this presentation, I hope that you take away is you should probably be cremated. Mr. Clark is sitting in the back. He's being very quiet, which he usually isn't. So what Zoe didn't tell you was how this whole thing started. We're going to show you a brief video, but there's a little backstory. I happened to find these tombs in a Forrest Gump run of mine one morning, and I stopped to chat with a couple of gentlemen. And then once that led to reaching out to a town clerk, because I am a former 911 operator and police officer for a short stint, only because I loved wearing that uniform. And I know that everything starts with birth, death, and marriage certificate. So I had done a legacy memorial for the gentlemen that work at Rockland Police Department because they were renovating their building, and I wanted them to have some sort of remembrance of how their department started. So that's how I learned a little bit how to do that.
Did you turn on your light?
Oh, I did.
Okay.
Sorry. Thank you so much, Noah. Thank you, Zoe. So I reached out to the town clerk, which is how it's going to start if any of you want to start a project like this. And they're the keepers of the vital records. So I reached out to Eileen McCracken, who was a wonderful person. And she said to me, there's a gentleman. I am going to be very cautious with sharing his phone number. His name is Jim Clark. He was one of the individuals responsible for putting the rock and the flagpole at the front of Beal Street, across from Super Stop and Shop, commemorating the Almshouse and the individuals that passed through their doors. So I call Mr. Clark and I say to him, hi, Mr. Clark, my name is Julie Christian. I went to Brown University. I was a former police officer and 911 operator. Now I'm a total washed up nothing. I was wondering if you could talk to me. And he said, what's your name? I said, Julie Christian. And he hung up the phone on me. So I called back again and I said, Mr. Clark, I don't mean to stir up any trouble in your life, but I'm really interested. I came upon these tombs. I don't know what I'm looking at. And I understand that you've done a little bit of work with the Almshouse. I'm going to tell you again, if I want to talk to you, I will call you. Click. So 2 weeks goes by, and somebody is calling me and hanging up. I call him back, and he said, meet me at the Cove, which is an apartment complex in Hingham. Meet me in the lobby at 7:30. We had masks then. It was all the COVID lockdown. And this gentleman comes out of his car, and he had 10 boxes of paperwork in different categories, all having to do with Beal Street, all having to do with the Almshouse, all having to do with the indigent. He has been saving this for 20 years. This is his big night. It's not mine. I just happen to be the person that raised my hand and said, may I take each box every week, Mr. Clark? I'll make copies and I'll start to assemble a story. And that's how it started. And then what happened was we went back to the town and we asked for the death certificates. I had never seen a death certificate in my life, but you'll see when we go through the presentation that everything starts with these vital records. And in order to understand and dispel this argument that these are indigent folks because of heroin addiction or alcoholism that led them to this, you have to understand what was happening in our country at the time of 1832 to 1932. It was a very different country, but it was very similar in that we suffered wars and pandemics. And it placed people into an almshouse. through really no fault of their own many times. And the Almshouse really was your first development of social welfare policy. In the town of Hingham, we had one on Beal Street. But in every town across Massachusetts, they had an Almshouse. And it was really a catch-all for folks. So I put them into an Excel spreadsheet. Then Jim and I could track the demographics of what age-related focus was. Most of these folks are older. When you see the death certificates, which is your cemetery, those are your corpses. And a lot of them are over the age of 60. Back then, what you're going to see is insane. There were cells in the bottom of that basement of that almshouse, and people were locked away. What then happened was these folks would be then transported up to Taunton Insane Hospital, and they always came back in a body bag. You'll see that as well, and we're going to walk you through. So, from my heart to yours and Jim's, thank you so much for sharing this journey with us. Zoe asked me how I was able to get 50 people in the room because she doesn't traditionally see this, and I said it must have been Jesus Christ himself, because it really had very little to do with Jim and I. We were simply the instruments that wanted you to all recognize your name, because at the end of our own lives, we all want to be remembered for the significant part we played, the difference in the lives that we had. So if you come away from anything, there's just two things that I want you to take away. You should probably be cremated. I am, just because of this project. And secondly, you need to treat people with loving, tender care the way you expect to be treated, because you have no idea somebody's condition in their life that brought them to the place that they're at. So if you see a homeless individual, we all just assume that they've done something to get themselves there. Sometimes life is really hard for folks. And that's all I have to say for right now. You're going to do a lot of reading tonight. So I hope you enjoy our presentation, and thank you so much for spending an hour with us this evening. Want to do lights, Zoe?
Oh, right. About to do the video.
I hope no one's afraid of the dark. So the tombs are 187 years old. This is a video taken on the day that I found them. And now you're going to find out how I found them. And they're right in the woods. If you walk Bear Cove Park, you'll be able to see them now that the leaves have all dropped from the trees.
To the untrained eye, this may appear to be just another busy intersection in any town, USA. But if we look a little closer, we see that the ocean is just a stone's throw from here in this direction, and only a few hundred yards away from these condominiums and sports fields is a public park that covers nearly 500 acres of woods, wetlands, and river coastline. Known as Bear Cove Park, it features two easily accessible points of entry, one here on the Beal Street side of town, and the other off of Fort Hill Street. What stands out about the Fort Hill entryway is the building that once served as an ammunition filling station during World War II is now the Fire Museum for the town of Hingham. This educational and historical depot, which is also part of the park, is open most weekends during the spring, summer, and fall. And this is where we ran into Jerry Duff, who not only knows more about the history of Hingham's fire department than just about anyone in town, but she could also easily moonlight as a tour guide for Bear Cove Park.
When we have an open house, I see a lot of this, in that people will bring their children in for a walk through the park. They go, oh, the museum's open. And they stop in and we talk about, hey, have you gone down to the riverfront to see the osprey catching fish? And once they walk through, and I said, you don't have to do the whole park at once, do a little at a time. And they keep coming back.
Throughout the park, there are countless reminders of its military history. The paved roads tying the property together, which at one time were a means of getting munitions from point A to point B, are now a great way for walkers, cyclists, and runners to get around.
The paved roads were left over from the military. They're making an easy walk and an easy place for your little guys to ride their bikes. There's no traffic. And as you walk along, if you access the town website, there's a map, and it tells you what kind of animals you might see.
A great way to see some of that wildlife is to enjoy the well-worn trails off the roadways. Even on a slow day, it's fun to watch our feathered friends go about their business without a care. Of course, there are those who like to use the trails off the trails, even if it means wrestling with brush and overgrowth. In particular, to reach this landmark that during World War II was used as a storage place for munitions. But prior to that, its purpose is still somewhat unknown. For the longest time, Bear Cove Park has been a great refuge for people here in town to get away from it all and soak in the abundance of nature that this place has to offer, even if it's just for a lunchtime walk. Of course, anytime we talk about land in New England, there's bound to be some history attached to it, and in this case, a little bit of mystery, like these tombs that are right behind me. It was these tombs that inspired a couple of locals to put on their own detective hats and find out what exactly they're doing back here. During one of her jogs along this path back in 2021, Julie Christian stumbled across and learned the history of this crucifix on the hill from another jogger. While that was strange enough, it was what he told her next that made her curious enough to look deeper into some of the other anomalies in these woods.
He said, hey, Julie, there's a tomb close by. And I stopped, I turned back and said, tomb? And then he told me it's in close proximity to where this crucifix was that I had seen.
Upon further inspection, there were in fact tombs on the property, but it was their condition that stood out the most.
Tombs are associated with cemeteries, and when you see doors ripped off cemeteries in a public park that's not memorialized, you think, what was it? Are the bodies still there? Where are the bodies? There's lots of questions that go on in your mind, and I thought to myself, I can't be the only one thinking these things.
Someone else was thinking these things, and his name is Jim Clark. Anyone who's taken the time to read this sign knows his handiwork. Nowadays, the roofline of these high-end condos has taken the place of the town's home for the indigent, known as the Almshouse, that once stood here for over 100 years. It's believed that during that period, these tombs were used to store the bodies of those who died at the Almshouse over the winter until they could receive a proper springtime burial. Visitors to the park can thank Clark for signs like this one, reminding people of what used to be here.
The Almshouse is now gone, and the tomb vault, if you will, is the only thing left to reflect what happened there at that time in history.
To the average person, Bear Cove is just a great place to get back to nature, take the dog for a walk, or go for a bike ride. For Julie Christian, the hope is that the experience here for others continues to be one of great enjoyment, with a touch of self-reflection.
I think people spend a lot of time walking through cemeteries, visiting loved ones, but there's a cemetery right here, an important cemetery. It was a benevolent act perpetrated by the town of Hingham for 100 years, and it helped more than 200 people walking in and out of the doors during 1832 to 1932 in a very difficult period of time in our country's history. I hope that they walk through and they take a moment to think about their own lives, their own mortality, how they make a difference in this world, and how they want to be remembered.
So we have a limited time left here, so we're going to go right into our presentation for you and just kind of walk you through what you saw in the video. So you're going to do a lot of reading. That's okay, Zoe. You're going to do a lot of reading tonight. So bear with me here. I'm not going to read all of this to you, but this was mentioned This is the crucifix. It's down a wooded path at Bear Cove Park. A lot of people miss it when they walk by it, but a lot of people walk by it. And it was called Bunker Alley. So there were bunkers throughout this park. You're going to hear from somebody at the tail end of this presentation that came forward on Friday afternoon and she wanted to share some information with me. And I thought it was so important that I invited him here tonight because he was a very important part of creating a museum that's down, the Green Dock Museum. We've left them for your purview to bring home and take a look at what they do there. And this is where the murder occurred. This was called Bunker Alley. There were bunkers down this wooded trail, and they were filled with graffiti. And after this murder occurred, this is a commemoration of these two gentlemen. They got more of a commemoration than the 71 individuals that you see in the back, and they should as well be equal to what they received is what they should receive in the back. So their names are inscribed at the top. They're buried in cemeteries by their family, but they took down all of the bunkers in the park after this event occurred. Next slide, please, Zoe. So in 2021, I saw the crucifix first. And then I came out, I asked a park ranger, what is this crucifix that I saw down a dirt path? Is it for a dog? He said, no, there was a brutal murder. I'm not going to give you the details. You can go home and look at the Patriot Ledger archives and the Boston Globe. So I said, okay. And as I ran away, I still don't think he knew why he said it to me. He said, there's tombs in the woods. And that's how the story really unfolded. I went back the next day. I called this lovely young lady in this blue dress that did all the posters that you may have seen around town, Lisa Finch. And I told her I was in the woods looking for a burial tomb. I had no idea what I was looking for. And this is what it would have looked like when these two gentlemen entered in. Their names are William Schrappen and David Lyons. They were in their mid-40s. They went in. They were from larger families, David Lyon was, and they became friendly. And they had hit rough times. The gentleman on the left is a naval veteran, and two young individuals from the town of Hingham decided they wanted to start a white supremacist cult. Yes, these things do happen in Hingham. And they decided to go into the woods that night. They were fully aware of where these gentlemen were living because the whole park was filled with the homeless. You'll see mattresses in the woods and evidence of clothes. It's just been left there over the years. And they went in and they beat them with spiked baseball bats and bludgeoned them to death. David Lyons begged for his life as he watched his friend William Schrappen beat to death and then have his hand severed, put in a plastic bag, brought to a party locally. And the two men that you're going to see up next, not yet, they called it their handbag. And they ended up, well, we'll go into the next slide and we'll show you the rest. So these are these two gentlemen. The gentleman on the left, he saved the state of Massachusetts the trouble of bringing him to court because he suffocated himself in his jail cell. He has Killa as his street tat on the back of his neck, and that is why he's wearing a coat. I don't know what happened to William Winquist. He's still in prison. He came up for parole last week, and they've kept him incarcerated. They found the hand based on, if you ever read the stories in the Boston Globe, it's fascinating because it was a group of individuals that were all part of different groups that were kind of doing things they probably shouldn't do, and then everybody was trying to tell on each other, so they turned on each other. And somebody turned on these two gentlemen and said, there's a hand buried up near power lines in Bridgewater. They showed it to me. Next slide, please. Thank you, Zoe. Jim Clark, would you like to come up and walk us through the history of that land?
Sure.
Thank you.
Yes? Where are we? In 1832. The almshouses began in Hingham around 1775-ish, and they built the almshouse on Short Street, where Gilo's gas station is, if any of you are familiar with that, and behind the coffee shop that's on the main street. in the bank by the buttonwood tree. So that was built at that time in 1775, and it wasn't taken down till like 2006 or 5. It lasted a long time. It was empty for a long time. Well, it wasn't used for its intended use. After that got too small, they went up the street to where the GER Hall is now, if you know where that's located, on Pond and Main, an intersection with the cannon out front and the church on the next corner. And that's where they built the larger almshouse. And that lasted till 1831. So that was built from 1817 to 1831. And it was a much larger place, so they could accommodate more folks, which they did. And then they had a problem, it burned down. So it burned to the ground. So now they're left with nothing. So you go back to 1832, town meeting met, they sent out a committee to go buy some land. They go down to Beal Street and they buy a 43-acre piece of property. And they figure we'll do a farm and we'll do the house. And what they did there is they built the biggest house, the biggest building in town for probably a long time. It was a huge building in those days for $13,000. All brick and slate roof. It was very nice for the time. And there was also a farm there, so the people who could work went out and worked the farm. They sold the product. They offset the cost of the house to the town, and it worked out, and everybody was happy. And the government shows up in 1903, 4, 5, and says, we want this side of the river. They go to Weymouth, give them a check, and they buy it from all the people that live on that side of the river. Then they come over to Hingham, and they buy this side of the river, and they knock on everybody's door. They give them all money. Everybody goes away, and they own both sides of the river. They had their eye on this after World War I. During World War I, they were going to buy the 43 acres. They bought everything but the 43 acres, never touched it. And before World War I ended, they started to make rumblings about getting this property. Then World War I ended, they said, we have no use for it now. So they left, the town still owned it. So the town owned it for another 20 years until World War II began. Then World War II began, they made some pretty interesting munitions, if you will. And at one point in 43-ish, they were building whatever munitions they were using at the time, but they were volatile enough where they had to have a bigger buffer zone for the Quincy Turnpike, which was Beal Street at the time. So they had to buy this property from the town. So they give the town $43,000 for 43 acres or whatever it was, you know? So the town goes away with 43, and they have no place to put the people. But the government must have accommodated them because they were living there until 1949. Some people were in there. And after that, it was the end of it, because then we had all the social services were involved from 35 on. And so be it, the people moved on. But it was an infirmary. It was the first town lockup, the first police department in Hingham. It was an infirmary. It was, you had, if the police found somebody upside down in a snowbank in the winter with no ID, they'd bring them over there. They found dead bodies, they'd bring them over there. People with no IDs, a baby, all kinds. There's a lot of interesting stuff you just don't see here, but a lot of things happen. I was amazed at how many people get hit by trains. Huh? There was only one track in town, right? But, you know, it was interesting. But it's been quite an experience, you know? And the people get buried there. In 1838, once after 5 years after they built the place and found out that people started to die, they had no place to put them in the winter. So they went to the town. The town authorized them $116.78 or something to go down and build that tomb you saw there. So they got a lot for their money, and it satisfied them through the winter. You know, it'd keep the people out of sight, out of mind for the winter, and then in the spring they could work the soil. You know, so the assumption is there's a lot of laws. I don't know how many attorneys there are here, but there's there's this many laws in the stack of books behind the attorney's chair, you know, and it's about what you can do to dead people or not, what you have to do to expired people, and it amazes me. You need a piece of paper to touch them. You need a piece of paper to bury them, move them, whatever you're going to do. There's supposed to be paperwork going this way, that way, and the other way, you know? And therein lies the problem. Where's the paperwork? So the cemetery is lost for all intents and purposes. And you can't convince me that the government would have come in and bulldozed the cemetery. It just wouldn't have, I can't imagine that happening. Nor did they use our whole property either. I mean, the buildings were here and there on a road, and there was always some empty space. But nevertheless, that's the story of the Almshouse. And here we are. What, excuse me?
Did the town run the Almshouse, or who?
Did they build it?
Who ran?
The town, they hired a superintendent and a matron, and they paid them. They're on the town payroll. There's all kinds of paperwork at the treasury, books, and, you know, this pluses, minuses, you know, accounting work for the books, how much the people cost. It used to cost you, they would hire a guy for $2 to dig the hole. They would hire another guy for $2 to build the coffin. I think you couldn't have spent more than $15 for the whole funeral. But if somebody expired there, you would call the family if they knew who they were, and they had the option to come and take the body. But times were so tough back then, nobody jumped, you know? Everybody didn't jump, so there were some people that were just left, which then the town has to bury them, you know? I mean, if you look at it that way, that's the only town-owned cemetery Hingham ever owned. You know? All the rest of the cemeteries in town are private. Excuse me?
Is there evidence that there was a cemetery there, like, in addition to the holdings, were there gravestones or any other,
Oh, no.
like potter's field?
One would assume they buried them in the ground, so the ground is still there. And if you don't have any paperwork saying you moved them, they're still there.
They've lost, the town has mismanaged the burial records.
You know?
Great question. They've lost all the records. The only testament to their lives is the pieces of paper that you see in the back. Those are the bodies that were lost. Jim, can you take us through the federal government bought the 43-acre parcel, and then can you take folks through in 1970 how it served at Project Turnabout? And then the developer came in.
Well, the government bought the property in 43, and they kept it till 72-ish. And then they decided to get rid of the whole park. So they gave Weymouth their side, Hingham got their side of the park, but Hingham didn't get their farm back and their building back, because at that time, Project Turnabout used to be in Hull, and they didn't have enough space, I believe, so they needed a bigger space, and they jumped at this opportunity to grab a big building, which they did. And they lived there for 30 years. So they were involved here for 30 years, till 2003, 4, 5, 6, something like that. And the developer went in and bought it from them. The town, I mean, you would think the town would have went and said, we want it back, you know, that's beyond me, I'm not elected. But those people would have, not ever, that'll never happen.
And an archaeologist was hired to scope the Cove land area, but there was never an archaeologist that was on site when the developer purchased Project Turnabout. So the person who did the site work, that was probably the second person I reached out to, and she said, there are human remains down there, but it wasn't the scope of my work. Those tombs.
Well, if you don't look for them, you won't find them. Right. Yeah. So that was. Anyway, that's how. Here we are today, and everything's as you see it there on the screen.
And we're going to wait for questions till the end, just because we're limited time.
Moving along, yeah.
Yep.
Thank you.
Was that other picture of the house, was that the Almshouse?
Yes.
The big brick building you saw,
This one.
right there. That building.
And Project
It was
Turnabout.
70 feet long, 3 stories high, 30 feet deep. It was a good-sized building.
What were there, 195,000 bricks?
Something like 175, 85,000 brick. It's all listed. They have records where you can, how much they bought the car. They put ads in the paper for bidders and, the whole thing. It was just like something happening today, except it happens then, and a lot of it's in microfiche, which you don't want to go there, I mean, you want to pay whatever these kids at MIT are going to charge you to make it, unscrew it,
And if you go down to the tombs, we have someone here that's going to not bring you down there tonight, but virtually bring you down there tonight. You're going to see bricks. There's probably like 200 bricks, I would say, that are stacked. So somebody, we don't know who, dug the right side of the tomb, and there are just bricks piled. So it was never meant to be weight-bearing. You're going to see later on this evening what the topography looked like. What it looks like now is literally a tomb in earth. It was not like that. And it's covered in bricks, and it has trees growing on it. So we had a company called Structures North who has done a significant amount of work in Salem to restore downtown Salem. And they came in and they said, this is a beautiful 187-year artifact. However, they're falling apart with time, and they cannot bear the stress of the trees.
At the stage we're at right now, if I might add for a second, and we'll have to go to the town, it's a good time to try and get it listed on the historic places because that's all that's left. Pretty soon the thing will disappear if it doesn't have protection, And that's all you can do with it at this point.
This is a little bit about the history of almshomes. Boston was the first in our country to have an almshouse, formalized almshouse, but it was originated in the 17th century in England. They were also called poor houses or poor farm. You've probably heard we're going to send everybody to the poor farm. And then social welfare. President Roosevelt enacted some policies that were placed for catch-alls for folks. Same types of catch-alls that helped us during the pandemic, that helps businesses survive. Same type of thing. So we went from relieving the poor through these institutions to then there was a point in time in Hingham where they were vendoing individuals. So you'd go into the poor farm and then they would rent you out. You would live with a foster family and you would work on behalf of the foster family. But there were children in the almshouse, there were infants in the almshouse, there were elderly, there was no nursing homes, there was no senior care. And again, we didn't know anything about Alzheimer's. We did not know anything about mental illness. So Taunton Lunatic Hospital took a lot of individuals from these almshouse homes because they just didn't know what to do with them. Next slide, please. This is a little bit about what Jim just spoke of. So it was 3 stories, 35 squares of slate roofing, square feet, it should say, 175,000 bricks, and it measured 70 feet long, and it had 3 holding cells in the basement, a cholera barn, a well, a cemetery, and a burial tomb were later additions. 197 residents we initially identified in the almshouse, and they included the elderly, the infirmed, the indigent, the homeless, vagrant, mentally ill, institutionalized, and children. If somebody wasn't capable of affording a funeral or a cemetery plot, they were in the custody and care of the town of Hingham, and they went to the almshouse. So they are now 187 years old. This was done last year. So our goal is to properly seal and commemorate the 71 individuals' names that we do have, because it's a safety issue now. It's a beautiful building. It's the only structure that is left to testify that these folks walk the planet. So we just want to see them sealed for safety, public safety reasons, as well as commemorative reasons, and have their names recognized as a cemetery. Mistakes happen. We understand that. It's not accusatory. There's a case up in Canada that you've probably been reading in the news about the Indian children. Things happen. We've progressed as a society, I hope. Next slide, please, Zoe. And Jim was referring to the earlier almshomes in Hingham. And this is just a timeline to give you some proximity of how we transitioned from house to house.
There aren't any photos of the second one. We couldn't find any anywhere. 10, 12, 13 to 1831.
Next slide, please, Zoe. And here's a timeline for you to see the progression. And what I've done here with Jim is we wanted you to understand that these were the reasons why folks were going into almshomes. It was very different than what we're seeing today. When was the individual building built? Oh, yes.
1987.
Was it 1987?
They moved there in 1987, and they built their first building there then, and they added on another building similar to the first one up on the hill. They wanted to go down by the river, but they didn't. They wound up relocating up on the hill.
We think the bricks that are on the tombs are from Hingham Fire and Mutual. When they were building out the Cove, they just dumped everything onto those tombs. The Cove owned the tombs at some point and then quickly realized they had a liability on their hands and gave them back to the town. Next slide, please, Zoe. So this area is a highly archaeological sensitive area. There's been records of Native Americans have been buried there. Jim actually had in his 10 boxes a Mary Toomey, who was responsible for Bear Cove Park that we see today, the transition from an ammunition depot to a park, with some other folks. But Mary Toomey was my mother's teacher in Weymouth. Funny enough, there's a lot of like connections in our story. And she was just an incredible human being. And so she and a gentleman named John Richardson, who owned a bookstore in Hingham, probably the first homosexual individual to come out in the town of Hingham. He was just a genius. He recorded every tree in that park. He recorded everything for the town of Hingham, and then went into the park, dug artifacts when the ammunition depot had ended, and then sold it back to the town. So he was very savvy too. The town owned it, but he sold it back to the town.
I got a lot of
Those two
receipts
got
of selling
together
stuff
and
to
they
the
said we
library.
need to find a spotted salamander, a turtle, or Indian remains to shut down the projects that were going to go on. And John Richardson found Indian, Native American remains in a foxhole. And Hingham Fire and Mutual could then not build their building down in the park along the water. So it stopped any kind of construction down on the water. So we're very lucky that we had them come along and find this. So the state of Massachusetts comes in when they find Native American graves, and they never disclose. They reinter them in a vicinity of. Jim had a little note from Mary Toomey on her own stationery that like X marks the spot of the treasure. She drew a map for her friend and said, this is where the Native American burials are. And it was an
X
Indian
on a
woman and her
circle,
3
yeah.
children. So that's up on Lincoln Street when you cross over the bridge and you go up towards the water. There's a series of rocks. And she said it's under the fir tree. There's 100 fir trees now. So I don't think anybody would reinter them and sell them on the internet. Next slide, please. And then we're going to have you do a little bit of reading, because this is really our sources, and this is how we put this all together for you this evening and how we told the story of these folks. And we used town reports, we used census records, we used death certificates, we used overseers of the poor reports, annual reports of the Board of Health, Lunacy, and Charity. That was your audit arm. And they went around to every almshouse in the state of Massachusetts. Hingham was exceptional. They did not have indoor bathrooms. They did not have hot water, running water. But what they did do is they took care of their indigent. They took care of them very well. They had no heating source other than fireplaces. And they had a cholera barn. And there was something we read in one of the audit reports was there was a gentleman that was found covered in his own feces living in the barn. He was separated from the rest. Perhaps the cells were filled down in the basement. I'm not really sure.
When it says skating 2 miles from the Hingham station, what's the Hingham 2 miles?
I think it might be a train depot. I'm thinking.
Oh, I see.
Yes.
Hingham what?
Hingham station. So this, over the course of 100 years
Beal?
is what you result in those burial records. But you could take a look here where it's
station.
telling you,
I see.
there are 15 inmates.
Train
They always
station.
had to have a count. 7 men, 6 women, and 2 boys. 2 of the women, EL 61 and BB 71, are insane. So those 2 individuals would have been sent up to Taunton Insane Hospital. They would have been brought back in the body bags. And here it is. The inmates are well clothed and fed, and now the number is 18. So these are the kind of reports that we were reading, Jim and I. And we had to do this in the very beginning, all virtually online. So we called people all across the country. We called the Army Corps of Engineers, just anybody that would even speak with us. Next slide, please, Zoe. Thank you. And this is what one looks like. And every town is listed in these reports for the state of Massachusetts.
Excuse me? I wanted to say something like, when I was in Eileen's office one time, the clerk, some lady called from New Mexico or someplace, and she was looking to find her grandmother that she had heard lived in the Almshouse there, wondering where she could find the records. So people, I was just there for that, but people must call in every once in a while, doing their genealogy and stuff, and so it comes up every once in a while. So to have records, you're still servicing people that either have relatives there or new, you know?
Great point, Jim.
And another, before you go on, speaking of people in the almshouse and whatever, some people had the attitude of they were nobodies, they were indigent or whatever, homeless, whatever you want to call them. And I says, but there's 25 streets in Hingham named after these people. Yeah, I'm saying, so they must have came from some substantial family or somebody to get your little name up on your street sign, you know? So there's a little more depth to it than, you know, a shellacking over the surface, you know?
Next slide, please, Zoe. And this is just a little bit about the history. This is more towards women, directed at the women. So what we found there were 110 males and 64 females that we're accounting for here when you get your 174 folks. So we say male and female because some of them were children, some of them were infants. And again, if your husband was tired of you, you were deemed a lunatic, and then you got shipped off to Hingham Almshouse, and then you got shipped off to Taunton. Next slide, please. Yes, Jack?
If people were originally in this arm,
Yes.
and you said they were transferred to Taunton,
Yes.
when they died, why wouldn't the town have paid a fee to have them in Taunton rather than one shipped back?
That was just the
a
system
good
that
question.
they had, Jack. They owned them, really. When we went to go pull death certificates, we were told that they were going to charge the town of Hingham, the clerk was charging us $10 a death certificate. And our response was, we don't own them, you do. So then we were backed by the BackRiver Bear Cove Park Committee. So we had to be supported by the Bear Cove Park Committee or a committee in town.
Sponsored, yeah.
And Bear Cove Park Committee didn't even know the tombs were
Was
in their
there.
purview. They had never been down. So we took those folks down on a field trip. But without them sponsoring us, we wouldn't have been able to collect the death certificates you see. And some death certificates we weren't even able to garner. And this is what our spreadsheet would have looked like. Next slide, please, Zoe. And this is from the Hingham Gazette in 1832. The summary is the benefits of putting the poor to work on the farm increases their appetite while reducing loitering around. So you saw on that previous slide the
Like
folks that were
teenagers.
brought back in a body bag. And if you think about it, you know, that's kind of an unusual statement because some folks in this room today are older, and you just think about having somebody tell you you're going to be working for your keep out on a farm. Next slide, please, Zoe. And this is what a death certificate looks like, which you can see down in the back and next. And so when you're looking at the death certificates, you'll see some kinds of interesting things that I'll point out to you. So CNBL is could not be located. So it could not be located. Oh, thank you. Oh, thank you. So here, when you see on the death certificates, could not be located. and the cause of death. Some folks had it, some didn't. This is the interesting one for Jim and I. So the name of the cemetery is the Almshouse tomb. So one would ask, well, if they were buried in the Almshouse tomb, why aren't they there anymore, and where are they? It must have been records. They kept every record of every piece of beef fat, right, Jim? Every cucumber, any green bean.
All kinds of stuff, except
copious
the stuff
records,
you
the
need.
heating fuel. And the town lost all the records pertaining to where they were buried.
I think some of that, what you just mentioned, is whoever did the paperwork would say, hi, they're buried in Hingham. There you go, eeny, meeny, where are they buried, But they went back to where their address is always, where did you come from? You came from, or where did you live at the time? You lived in the Almshouse or whatever. And so that's where they would sort them out, I assume, once you got back here.
So you see, frozen to death from the effects of excessive liquor. How many people in the room have had excessive liquor? Maybe a couple. Thank goodness you didn't die in 1832 to 1932.
Yeah. With no heat, you can only imagine.
And here's just how we were started to track. This is our build out of our Excel spreadsheet. This is just an excerpt from them. We have all the names listed. And you can see the names on the right-hand side and the place where they were buried. So, as Jim said, Hingham owns 2 cemeteries. One is Canterbury, very small cemetery, and the second one is what we're discussing with you tonight. Next slide, please. Next slide, please.
So tomb at Almshouse is the tomb?
Yes.
Those are the people you can't find.
Yes, or anything having to do with town farm or almshouse. It was referred to a number of different ways, but could not be located is also encapsulated here too, because if they don't know, cannot be located, then.
That means they're not someplace else either.
And then Jim and I, cross-referenced genealogy reports. We did a lot of cross-referencing to make sure that what we're saying is true, that these are the individuals that are missing. Next, you see 4 months on that last one was how old? 1 month up at the top there. 11, 16, 28. Some of the ages are really interesting. Next slide, please, Zoe. 3 weeks old. Next slide, please, Zoe. Next slide, please. 1 year old. And next slide, please. And here we are at the end of our presentation. So you thought.
Let me say something before.
Sure.
When you saw all the people in the cemeteries they were attributed to, a lot of people think the Hingham Cemetery belongs to the town. It's a private cemetery. You have to pay to get in. This isn't a Hingham Cemetery is not really the Hingham Cemetery. It's the Hingham Cemetery. Same thing with the Hingham Historical Society. Everybody goes, well, go to the Historical Society. Well, that's a private entity too. It's not like automatic. It's you walk in there and say, hi, I'm from Hingham. I want to look at this. Wait a minute. You got to make an appointment. Somebody's got to be there. You want to call. You got to pay. It's just when you just open the newspaper and you go, oh, Hingham. You just assume that it's a town deal. Everything's the town. It's not always the case. I rest my case.
I wanted to introduce you to a lovely human being that reached out to the librarian and asked if he could share some information with me. So Jim and I went over to his home on Sunday, and we spent a couple of hours with him. This is Stephen Gill. He's a retired attorney. He's a naval veteran. He served our country, and then he was instrumental in the Green Dock Museum. He's colorized all the maps. So what we had him do is he took a look at the area and was kind enough to pull some of the information for you tonight to show you. And one careful thing I want you to pay attention to is the pictures that you saw of that tomb are beneath the earth. The land is this way. What Stephen is going to present to you is he's going to show you that the topography of the land was flat. So it would have been a perfect place to build a cemetery because it was farmland. It wasn't as hilly as what you see today. So Stephen Gill, here you are. Here are your new friends.
Here you are, huh?
Well,
I have to commend Julie and Jim for the work that they've done. It's really impressive. I came into this late in the game. I did have a little presentation, and I have to kind of add a new one on. Having watched that, I actually worked in the Almshouse.
House itself.
Yeah, believe it or not. And when I was in college, I was finishing up my bachelor's degree at UMass Boston. I had to do an internship. So I volunteered to work at the Turnabout. And what Turnabout was these people who were pre-release drug addicts who were being released into society. And my job was on weekends to supervise them. So what would happen was I would get there like on a Friday, and they would have these meetings with the psychiatrist, right? And they would get a group of these drug addicts together, and they would encourage them to tell each other what they thought of each other. Well, all I could hear was yelling and screaming and punching and fighting and blood and guts and gore. And then that would start my weekend. So what I did at the time, I played guitar, and I used to manage musical groups. So I would bring in musical groups on the weekend to rehearse, and they loved it. So I had no problem. I got an A on my internship. But the real story I was going to tell you briefly before we get into this was how, if you saw in your chair, there's a little note. It tells you about the Bear Cove Park. I was going to give you just a very brief history that I concocted on my own. This is my own, if you will, scholarship. But this has to do with John D. Long. John D. Long was born in Maine, but later on he was elected to the Massachusetts House of Representatives in 1874. 1879, he was lieutenant governor. 1880, he was the governor of Massachusetts. And then in 1896, William McKinley ran as president of the United States. So when he was elected, he selected John D. Long to be the Secretary of the Navy. Well, and this is where the story gets interesting, because he also appointed Teddy Roosevelt as the Assistant Secretary of the Navy, and they hated each other. So we were having problems with Spain. They owned Cuba at the time. And in 1898, in January, John D. Long sent the USS Maine to Cuba, to Havana Harbor. Well, on February 15th, the USS Maine was sunk. So therefore, we ended up going to war in April. Well, in May of 1898, Teddy Roosevelt resigns as the Assistant Secretary of the Navy. His friend was Secretary of War, and he ends up getting a commission as Lieutenant Colonel. He goes down to Cuba. He fights the Battle of San Juan Hill. He comes back. He's elected governor of New York. Well, the thing was, when McKinley was running again, he wanted to have a new vice president, so he selected Teddy Roosevelt. So in 1901, McKinley sworn in, and Teddy Roosevelt is now the Vice President of the United States. Well, in September of that same year, McKinley was assassinated. So now Teddy Roosevelt is the President of the United States. John D. Long is still Secretary of the Navy. So now you have, he used to be Teddy's boss, and now Teddy is his boss. So in 1902, John D. Long resigned from the cabinet of Teddy Roosevelt. He came back to Hingham. Matter of fact, he lived on Cottage Street in Hingham. There's a bird sanctuary there today you can visit where he used to live, and he's buried in the Hingham Cemetery. So in 1903, the Congress passed the funds to acquire what was called a naval magazine. And, you know, when you go through Hingham, you don't really see it as a military town. And so there was a lot of skepticism as to why Hingham was selected, seeing that John D. Long was the Secretary of the Navy. So anyway, many years later, he was questioned about this. In 1911, I'll quote him directly because he was questioned by the U.S. Senate. And they said, Mr. Chairman, I understand your proposition to be that the location of the naval magazine is of no benefit to the neighborhood. Mr. Long, as a citizen of Hingham, I would be glad if you would carry it away, and in saying that, I am expressing the view of the community. The chairman, it never would have gone there but for you. I had no idea it was going there. I was undoubtedly Secretary of the Navy when the commission was appointed to find a place. The people of Boston and Chelsea wanted to get rid of the magazine in their neighborhood. I undoubtedly appointed the commission to investigate the shores of New England to find a place, but there was not a slightest inducement offered to me or the citizens of Hingham. So he denounces any kind of claim that he had something to do with it. And just as a footnote, in 2001, Teddy Roosevelt received the Medal of Honor for his escapades down in Cuba. So that's the little story. That's how it got started. And then when they opened they actually opened the base in 1904. In 1904, they also added what was called you would be familiar with the Hingham, that was the Hingham Naval Ammunition Depot, but they had the Hingham Training Station, which was a basic training for Navy recruits. And so the Naval Training Station was closed in 1925, but the ammunition depot continued until 1965, or 1962, somewhere around there. It was turned over to the town. But during the war, they had an expansion. They acquired the property now known as Wampatuck State Park that became the Cohasset Annex, part of the Hingham Naval Ammunition Depot. And at the same time, right after Pearl Harbor, they acquired what's considered now the shipyard. And the interesting thing was the shipyard was built so quickly. There's stories that there was a restaurant there and there were people eating. They threw them out and they bulldozed the building. That's how quickly they built that thing overnight. So what we're going to show you here is a couple of pictures from the area. So if you're not familiar, you can see on the map here. So this first slide is basically just Google Earth. And so what we're looking at here, which one do I push?
The middle.
The middle
Yeah.
one, okay. All right, so once this thing. Okay, so we have the Stop and Shop here, right? Over here on this side, for the women, it's Michael's Craft Center. For the guys, this is Lowe's. Okay, so you come across the bridge here, you can take a right onto Beal Street, and this here is called Lynch Field. So today, if you want to come in, there's some parking over here, and then there's a little gate here, and you can walk down this path. Now, if you come down this path here, there's a path into this new complex called the Cove. And if you were to, trespass and walk up there, there's another path down here into the park. Now, right over here is where this tomb is. And I would like to make a correction, if I might, because from my understanding, no one was buried in that tomb. That's where they stored bodies in the wintertime because the ground was too hard to dig a grave. So they would store them in there, and then when the spring came around, they would then bury them. So the next slide, please. Okay, so this is what the base looked like when it was open. Over here you have the Weymouth Twin Drive-In, that same bridge on 3A, coming down Beal Street here. And this here is where Turnabout was. That's where I worked. And this is where this building at the time was a storage facility for ammunition. And you can barely see it here, but there's these lightning rods. And they did not want the lightning to hit the building filled with ammunition, so they put these rods on so they would hit those instead. So this here is what the base looked like at that time. This little area here kind of indicates where that tomb is. So next slide. Okay, so this is now modern day. This is the building is now gone. It's where this area is.
1, 3, 4.
Those two poles are still there, the lightning rods. And right about in here is where the tomb is. So if you were to go down that path from Lynchfield, you would just walk down the path and go over here. If you cut through, like I said before, if you want to trespass, you could cut through there and do that. So the next slide, please. Okay, so this is kind of another view, kind of comparing the two areas. So you saw this picture before. There's those lightning
And that
rods.
picture was taken in what year?
This was around 1940. This one on the left. The one here on the right is fairly current.
Shows the insurance company.
This here was that was the insurance company. That was prior to Cove being built. But in this picture here, you can see those lightning rod arresters. One's here in the trees. It's kind of hard to see. But over here is where the tomb would be, right up in that area. Now, I got to tell you, it's a little bit arduous to get over there. It's not really like easy. You would have to like climb over trees and stuff that you saw at the beginning. So I would recommend wearing long pants, maybe the long shirt, if you feel like the urge to go find it. Next, please. That path, if you were coming down the walkway, this actually brings you down into the park. But right over here is where the tomb is.
Yeah.
You can't walk off of this to get there. You have to come to the bottom and go back over there again. And I think that was it on the slides. Oh, there's one last slide. So this kind of shows you what it looks like when you get in there. This is where the tomb is. And that's the Cove today. And I think that's it for me.
Thank you so much, Stephen. Thank you.
Thank
Very
you.
well done. Thank you. Beautiful job. Beautiful.
Very good. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you,
Thank you,
Kelly.
Zoe.
Thank you so
Thank
much,
you, folks.
everyone.